Good morning. Welcome to Monday in May for our Zoomed In on Real Estate. We've been doing every other month this year, so we'll see how you guys like that frequency to kind of update you on everything CCIAOR and what's going on in the industry. So we'll have those kind of conversations every other month on the third Monday of the month. And so we're here today. We got two great guests. From the Massachusetts Association of Realtors, Catherine Taylor and Jonathan Schreiber, and I'll talk about them later on as well, but want to run through a couple updates for you guys as we get started on this Monday. As always, the Zoomed In on Real Estate is presented by and sponsored by the Cooperative Bank Cape Cod. So we want to thank our partners there for their sponsorship of this webinar series that we do. Our upcoming virtual CE schedule, you see 4 classes through the end of June. Code of Ethics is a wait list at this point. So if you have signed up and you're not going, please cancel your registration so we can get others in. But if not, then also get on the wait list if you'd like to take that on this Wednesday. Next week is escrow. Then in June, buyer agency and selling historical properties. So take a look at those different days of the week, different times. So take a look, sign up for what you can as well. We have done our in-person for this quarter already, so we won't be looking till the third quarter for our next session of in-person classes, and as we're doing once per quarter for in-person, for several classes a day. So be on the lookout for that if you're looking for in-person. We have our Realtor Social for May coming up this week, May 18th, at the Guild Mortgage office in Hyannis, with Eric Seenstra over there. He's bringing you guys into his office, and should be a really fun time over there on C Street. Hope sign up, come by, have a drink with Eric and socialize with other realtors around the Cape. Should be a great event. Also, we have our week of volunteering. This is partnered through the National Association of Realtors, who does their Cape-wide week of volunteering, June 4th through June 10th. I'll talk about all the individual sessions we have, but this is Cape-wide for this. All right, so we have a couple of volunteering opportunities that are already full, which is Tommy's Place on Sunday, June 4th, and the Cape Kid Meals volunteer opportunity on June 8th, but the others are still open and have spots as we hit up the Cape Cod Foster Closet on Monday, June 5th. Also on Monday, June 5th is the Cape Cod Children's Museum. Dream Day in Cape Cod on both Tuesday and Friday, as well as Hack's Carriage House on June 7th. And then you've got the Cape Cod Meridian and Museum and Cultural Center on June 9th, and then the Homeless Prevention Council's Walk for Home on June 10th. So check out all those sessions that we have coming up. Volunteers show how realtors care across the Cape and are getting involved in making an impact on our communities. Thursday, June 15th at the Pelham House, we have our Night in the Spotlight, our summer soiree and awards night, our annual event we do where we honor those who for the year, but also just a big get together and networking and social opportunity for you guys to be with each other. Like I said, Thursday, June 15th, the Pelham House Resort. $75 a ticket up till the first 150 sold, and then it'll raise up to $100 a ticket after that. Over a third have already been sold for the 75 reduced ticket price, so make sure you get yours in if you plan to come. That's Summer Soiree and Awards Night on June 15th. We will be we'll be honoring our Realtor of the Year, our Distinguished Service Award Chuck Lockhart recipient, our Good Neighbor Awards, as well as our Affiliate of the Year. So please take the time to come and attend that. Always a great night. Heard the other day in a meeting, people saw the best event of the year. So make sure you attend that. You don't want to miss it. All right, couple real estate market stats for the month. Is I think closed sales are going exactly where all of us in the real estate business thought closed sales would be, which is down. As mortgage rates have spiked, as inventory is still depleted, when you have all of that, that closed sales continues to be there. Declined. I think we all saw that coming. So as you see year to date, we're 21% down. We were 21% down from 21 to 22. We're another 17.6% down from 22 to 23. So as you see that, we're doing exactly what kind of we expected to see in the marketplace there. April once again followed the same trends there as well. However, our inventory from homes for sale in April kind of ticked up. And we'll talk about that. That does not mean there's more listings out there coming on the market. So traditionally when you see inventory homes for sale, you say, okay, there may be more listings coming on for sale. However, there's not. What we saw in April was another decline in new listings. Obviously that 68% spike from 2020 to 2021 that you see was because April 2020 had virtually no new listings come on for obvious reasons. And then you've seen the decline since then. What I would say is the reason why you're seeing that inventory spike is obviously less selling, less going pending. Pendings were down almost 20% again, or 13-14% down. So as you see that decline in activity, that's where you're seeing more properties sit, and that's where you see the slight inventory bump we just saw on the slide before. So that's what seems to be going on in the market right there. Listings for the year are way down as well, as we expected. You have virtually 26% of the marketplace that have a interest rate under 3%. You've got over 95% of the mortgages under 5%. You're just not going to see all that. Here are a couple slides from Lawrence Yunn's, the national NAR chief economist, of what he's forecasting for the future. I thought were interesting. He presented these at the NAR legislative meetings conference last week in Washington, D.C. Is that he expects as mortgage rates continue to kind of rise this year, in 2024, you'll start seeing a reprieve as they get below 6 and into the mid 5s again in 2024, but doesn't see much relief beyond that in 2024. And then home sales. The blue bar is the new home sales, the red bar is existing home sales. So as he does expect to see as rates decline in 2024, that you'll start seeing home sales start ticking up again. We'll see if that happens on the Cape, see if we have inventory to be able to sell at that point. But we'll see how that all plays out hopefully as we get new listings on. If we do see continued decrease in demand this year, and you see some inventory rise, maybe we'll see that home sales shift with the national conversation. But as we know, there is no national housing market. It is all local. So you are the best equipped to explain to buyers what's going on in our local market, because even town by town, village by village is different on the Cape, and that's where your expertise and value comes in. Couple things coming up too, and we'll talk about these more with our guests today. But June 12th, we have Realtor Day on Beacon Hill. We have a great contingent already signed up, but we'll be providing transportation with pickups at our office at 22 Midtech Drive in West Yarmouth and at the Sagamore Park and Ride. And so June 12th, we'll be leaving. You can find all the details in the sign-up sheet that I know my staff is going to be sharing out in the chat. So please take time to come. Johnny will probably be talking today about some of the issues we'll probably be tackling and talking about at Realtor Day on Beacon Hill. We'll also be providing lunch there as well for you. And then also the newly expanded Massachusetts Association of Realtors Legal Hotline. We now have 4 attorneys to staff it. 2 of them are on today, Catherine Taylor and Jonathan Schreiber. But now it's not just for brokers only. Agents can also call the hotline, and I'm sure Catherine will explain that a little bit and how that's going in our conversations today. But make sure you reach out. Legal hotline at maarealtor.com or 1-800-370-LEGAL. A great member benefit that MAR has expanded for your benefit to get legal, to assist you with questions about current laws, court rulings, professional standards, or best business practices. So I am going to stop my presentation here and bring on Catherine Taylor and to talk a little bit. I think she's going to start out with a little bit, and then we'll head into Jonathan Schreiber. But Catherine is the Director of Education, Associate Counsel at the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. So Catherine, I know you have a presentation talk about some of the new forms, some of the updates to forms, and some of the other things you guys are seeing on the legal hotline in the last couple months to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us this morning. I'm just going to get my screen share going here. All right. So as Ryan had mentioned, our legal hotline is newly expanded. All agents, members are able to call in and speak with one of the attorneys. Generally 9 to 4 every day. You'll be able to get your questions answered or via email as well. If you are a salesperson, we always follow up with an email that includes your broker. So everybody's on the same page as far as issues going on within the brokerage. So what I wanted to touch on today were some of the main issues that we're seeing and hearing about coming through the legal hotline, and try to reduce your potential liability by giving you some additional knowledge. We have many new forms that have been added or updated in our forms library. We are always reviewing it to make sure that our forms library is up to date and providing you the resources that you need to be successful in your businesses. We have a new tenant representation agreement, similar to a buyer representation agreement, but for when you're working with a prospective tenant, assisting them in their search for a rental property. We've updated our extension of time of representation agreement. Previously, we had 2 standalone forms that addressed both a buyer agency agreement and exclusive right to sell agreement. We have updated that into 1 form that also includes the representation for tenants as well. Not a big issue on the CAPE itself, but we have a new updated concrete foundation advisory and disclosure. You may have heard some of your counterparts in the western regions of the state discussing the issue of pyrrhotite. This is aimed at addressing toward that issue. Backed by popular demand from the realtors on the Cape is the short-term rental 14-day exemption. This has been re-added to the library to allow you to explain to your clients and protect you in the event that you are working with somebody who says they are renting for fewer than 14 days in a calendar year and do not need to remit that tax on the short-term rentals. And I also just wanted to highlight that soon we will have 3 forms that are most commonly used available in 3 languages. That's going to be your contract to purchase, your standard residential sale purchase and sales agreement, and your exclusive right to sell listing agreement. They're going to be available to you in Spanish, Portuguese, and simplified Chinese. So those are going to be for information only purposes. You still want to be signing the actual contracts themselves in the English version, but this is to assist you if you are working with clients where English may not be their first language and it's easier for them to understand the provisions in a different language. Also wanted to highlight one of our newer forms. It's not the newest. It's form 527. It's disclosure of personal financial interest. It is something that's been getting a lot of attention lately, and we just wanted to highlight that simply noting in the MLS that you are representing a property that you personally own or a family member owns is not sufficient to satisfy the regulations. It has to be in writing and acknowledged by the other parties to the transaction. So we developed this new form to assist you with facilitating that compliance with the regulation. And again, this is if you have a personal financial interest or you're working with a family member who has a personal financial interest in that transaction. One of the questions we get a lot is with regard to modifying the MAR forms. Generally speaking, no, you cannot modify them. They are all copyright protected. If you don't like the language we use, we recommend that you work with an attorney to develop your own forms. However, certain contingency language can be stricken or modified. Always work with an attorney to ensure that you're doing that in an appropriate manner and not engaging in the unauthorized practice of law. But we've created a number of different addenda that are in our forms library to help you lessen the need to work with an attorney to develop something to address the situation. We always try to make sure that we have forms that are going to address most of the more common scenarios that may come up in a transaction. So if you're saying, oh, I really wish I had a different inspection contingency, for example, take a look at the forms library. There's a good chance that it already exists there. And if you notice that there is something missing that you could really use in your practice, please do let us know. We'd be happy to bring it before the forms committee to discuss and see if it would be appropriate to add to our forms library. One of the biggest questions we always get through the legal hotline is with regard to disclosure. What do I have to disclose? Am I serving my client's best interests? How do I make sure that I am fulfilling my obligations under Chapter 93A without hurting my seller's interest? So there's kind of 5 buckets here that are required disclosure. Massachusetts, as we know, is primarily a buyer beware state. There's not a whole lot you have to affirmatively disclose. But again, Chapter 93A is where you, as the licensee in the transaction, are obligated to disclose known material facts related to the property that might influence a prospective buyer's decision. You have to know that you're not obligated to discover defects with the property, but if you are aware of them, you cannot hide them. Lead paint, if the property was built prior to 1978, you must appropriately complete the lead paint disclosure, share the information that the seller has with regard to lead paint on that property. Septic systems. Big issue on the Cape. Obviously, if the property is serviced by a septic, you must perform a Title V inspection on that property prior to transfer or within 6 months after transfer if it wasn't accessible due to winter or something along those lines. But that does need to be disclosed to a prospective buyer. If you receive any direct questions from the buyer, you obviously have to provide a truthful answer to that question. And then one question that's been coming up a lot lately is with regard to off-site conditions. So when is there a disclosure obligation if there's an issue that's not on the property itself that's being sold, but something that's outside the bounds of that property, but might affect that property? And we have a 3-pronged test to help analyze whether those issues might require disclosure. It comes from a 1997 SJC case. And in that case, the court laid out the following 3 prongs, all 3 of which need to be satisfied in order to require disclosure. It has to be unknown and not readily observable to the prospective buyer. So if they can see it when they're driving to the property, that's going to defeat that prong. The second is that it has to affect the use, habitability, of that property or the ability to enjoy that property. And third, it has to have an effect for a reasonably objective buyer would find that to be something that would materially impact the value of that property. And generally, these types of issues are going to be rooted in the land, as the court said. It's going to be things like groundwater contamination as opposed to transient social conditions like a neighbor who likes to throw a party every weekend. So generally it's related to things that are going to, be in the land affecting that property that not with people in the neighborhood. So that's kind of a tricky analysis. Generally would recommend working with an attorney if there's a question with regard to an offsite disclosure. We've also been receiving a lot of inquiries with regard to advertising compliance, what you can do, what you can't do, how to ensure that you are operating within the bounds of the Code of Ethics and our statutory regulatory framework here in Massachusetts. So that first bucket you have obviously is going to be Article 12, primarily from the Code of Ethics. It says everything has to be honest and truthful. And then you've got our regulations in 254 CMR 3, which are similar to the Code of Ethics in that everything has to be honest and truthful. You have to identify the broker with whom you are affiliated. Your advertisements cannot be discriminatory in any way. And then sort of the big bucket that's been coming up a lot is issues with regard to teams and advertising as a team. What can you do and what can't you do? And I'm going to get to that a little bit more in a minute. But one of the newer issues that's been popping up is the use of AI in your real estate businesses. And for those of you who attended the conference a couple weeks back, we had a big presentation on this. And while it's exciting and new, there's still a couple things you want to keep in mind when using artificial intelligence, whether it's modifying images or using it to help you write a property description. Keep in mind that you still are going to have disclosure obligations, and that still has to be an accurate representation of the property. So if the property is empty or under construction and you use one of these programs to do virtual staging, or say this is what it could look like once the construction remodel is done, make sure you're disclosing that so that a prospective buyer knows that is not currently what the property looks like. If you're using virtual staging, make sure that you're actually using items of furniture that would fit in that room. Make sure you're not removing any permanent structures or fixtures in the property. Keep those telephone wires there. They might be unsightly, but they're a fact and they have to be there. Make sure that you're not misrepresenting the property through the ability to edit it. Of course, always review it for accuracy. If you say in Chat GPT, write me a description of, why it's wonderful to live in Yarmouth. And you want to make sure that what it says, what it pops out for you, is accurate and doesn't contain any fair housing violations. That's one of the things we've been seeing a lot of, is that if you say, write me a property description or tell me why it's good to live in this town, it's going to pop out a lot of things that say it's family friendly, low crime rates, great schools, things along those lines, which are sort of those, red flags that you want to make sure you're not including in your property description. So don't copy and paste and go. Make sure you're given a review for accuracy. And then just keep in mind copyright considerations as well. This is certainly something that's being tested in the courts as far as the use of artificial intelligence and what is or is not copyrightable as a result of that. But if you are using somebody else's work and then using AI to adjust it, there may be copyright considerations. So please do still make sure that you are getting the appropriate permissions before using somebody else's images or descriptions, things along those lines. So getting to teams in Massachusetts, we have a new Teams FAQ, which I realize now on the screen is terribly small. So I apologize for not doing a better job on this slide, but the Board of Registration has put out a Teams FAQ. And I just wanted to highlight one of the questions in there, which is with regard to team names. It all comes down to a consumer protection standpoint, where you have to ensure that your team name is not giving a consumer the impression that you are an independent entity, but rather it must still be clear that you are a part of a larger brokerage. So they included a list of words that should be avoided in your team names because they can lead to confusion. Things like brokerage, associates, real estate, realty, property. You just want to be very careful that it's that your team name that you use is clearly indicating in what capacity you're operating. So some key issues with teams that come up. The first is affiliation. Remember that salespeople can only affiliate with the broker. You cannot affiliate solely with a team. It is not a mini brokerage. Within a larger brokerage, you're still affiliated with the broker. Teams cannot hold funds. They cannot have their own escrow accounts. They cannot hold any of those transaction funds. Again, they must all flow through that brokerage. Advertising, we just touched on. And compensation is really where we've been hearing a lot of questions, particularly with teams who want to set up an LLC, for example, have the team be paid and then have the compensation flow through the team LLC. That's generally going to be problematic because one, that LLC needs to be separately licensed. And two, if the individuals that are members of the team are salespeople, then you have an issue of, is this a violation of the single affiliation requirement for a salesperson? If they're being compensated by that team leader, who is perhaps a broker or an LLC within their brokerage, then they're working under two different brokers, which is a violation of our regulations. So individual brokers who are members of a team, of course, can set up an LLC as long as it's properly licensed and be paid that way from the broker, not from the team leader. It should all flow from that broker all the way at the top. Yeah, so we just touched on most of the stuff on this screen. The only thing I didn't discuss was team logo. And again, it all goes back to that consumer protection standpoint. Teams can have their own logos. They can advertise as long as it's clear who they are in relation to the broker. Massachusetts doesn't have specific advertising requirements for teams. There's no ratio specifically that's required. Some other states have that. However, keep in mind that the broker name still needs to be clear, readily apparent to the consumer. And many brokerages have their own internal policies with regard to those ratios. So if you're working in a team, make sure to talk to your broker and see if they have those requirements. But don't put it little itty bitty down in the corner. Even if there are no brokerage requirements, make sure it's readily apparent to a consumer that, the Catherine Taylor team is part of, Schreiber Realty. So antitrust, of course, has been getting a lot of attention lately on a national scale with the lawsuits that are floating around out there. So we just wanted to touch on a couple of the big issues that we get over antitrust. The big buckets of liability with antitrust come from price fixing, group boycotts, and market allocation. So price fixing is, of course, when two or more competitors say this is what we're going to charge the consumer. You can set your prices independently within your brokerage, but don't be talking to your competitors about what they charge consumers, what their split is. And particularly in the realtor world, when we're going to committee meetings and conferences and other events, it's easy to have those conversations sort of inadvertently, but just, keep that at the front of your mind that you should not be discussing commissions or splits or anything along those lines with your competitors. Group boycotts are similar. So when two or more brokerages sort of collude together to say, we're not going to work with XYZ brokerage, we're just going to work with each other, and it essentially freezes that other brokerage out of the marketplace. The market allocation is, of course, where two brokerages say, all right, well, I'm going to take, the western part of the city, you take the eastern part of the city, and we're not going to cross into each other's territory. That is problematic as well because it's reducing the options available to the consumer. So that leads to the question that we get at least once a week through the legal hotline of, well, can you advertise what you charge as your commission? And the answer to that is yes, with an asterisk, because you want to be careful that when you're advertising what it is that you're offering to a consumer and what your rate is, don't use that as a comparison. Don't say, I charge less than, the market, or the standard commission rate, because we all know there is no standard commission. You can say, I charge X, this is what I provide you for X. Don't say, why pay ABC brokerage X when you can work with me and pay only X? That is, we're going to get into some problematic territories. And, of course, when you're talking to consumers about your services, be cognizant of discussions related to, again, that comparison to other brokerages. Say, this is what I have to offer you. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. Don't compare yourself to them or say how you're, different from them. But focus on your brokerage business practices and fees when trying to sell yourself to a consumer. And of course, there's no standard fee. I don't think I can say that enough. Of course, everyone has seen the NAR resources that are available out there. There's Real Estate Commission Facts and Competition.Realtor. If you haven't taken a look at either of these, strongly encourage you to do so. There's tons of good resources on there to help you understand this issue of antitrust and commissions in real estate. Helps you have that conversation with your clients, with consumers. There's like infographics that you can download and use on your social media and provide to consumers. So certainly take a look at that if you have not yet ventured there. There's a new scam happening in the marketplace. Many of you have probably heard of it. It has come up a few times on the Cape, actually already, from what we're hearing. And it's generally coming up with vacant land or properties that aren't occupied, and somebody is posing as the owner and wants to sell the property. So, we just wanted to highlight a couple of things that you can do to properly identify your seller client to ensure that they are who they say they are and that they actually have that authority to sell the property. Oftentimes, when you are faced with this potential scam, you're going to be contacted by somebody who is out of the area, unable to meet in person. They're going to be hesitant to engage in like a video lead or share identification. And those are all red flags that you should take a step back and slow down and verify that this lead is a legitimate individual with the right to sell that property. You can identify who the proper owner / seller of that property is by looking through the tax records, the registry. If you're concerned, send a letter to the address listed through those resources, and see if you get a response to verify that it is the appropriate individual. Of course, Google has a ton of information, and you can find out a lot about an individual and who they are, and if they are who they are saying they are through that. Of course, video meetings are commonplace, so push for that so you can see them. You can read a lot on a person's face and tell if they seem perhaps like they're not a legitimate lead. And if it's a buyer, ask for proof of funds before you engage with them, whether that's actual proof of funds or a pre-approval letter, anything along those lines, to again establish that they have the ability to engage in the transaction they're looking to engage in. And with that, I'm
Catherine, one quick question we had come in around your session. We'll get to the other question in Johnny's. But is there a definition of a team? Like, what is a actual team according to the state, or is there one?
I mean, so there's not actually a definition, right? There's sort of this ambiguous thing that we've made up as part of the real estate marketplace. Teams are not specifically defined or addressed in any of our statutes or regulations. Really, what it is if there's two or more people within the same brokerage who choose to work together as a unit, right? If I were to put a definition on it, that's what I would do. That's my definition. It doesn't come from, anybody formally, but the broker still has the ability to determine whether they're going to allow teams and, place parameters around how those teams operate. But essentially, a team should still be looked at as an individual salesperson who's affiliated with a broker. And all those same requirements are going to apply to the team as it would for a salesperson. So with regard to single affiliation and escrow and advertising and all of that information, think of it just as if you were an individual rather than working as a team. The bigger issue that comes up with teams, I would say, and I didn't want to get into this because it's a little bit of a can of worms, is agency relationships within teams can get very, very complicated. And that's really something where you have to be engaging in a conversation with your brokerage about how is agency going to work within the team? Are we a traditional agency? Are we designated agency? For a designated agency, is the whole team designated as one side of the transaction, or can you have both sides of the transaction with the team? Do they have those procedures and policies in place to prevent that information sharing that allows you to engage in designated agency? So it can get quite complicated very quickly, particularly if a team has, for an example, like an unlicensed admin that assists them with transactions. That makes having designated agency within the team that much more complicated.
And then, because I've always laughed about it, because if you're a traditional agency company, you pretty much are a team according to the way you work anyways.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a good way to look at it.
All right, cool. Great. And I'll bring in Johnny Schreiber, who's the Regulatory and Legislative Counsel of Massachusetts Realtors. He's going to give you a little bit of a legislative update, and then also hopefully also encourage you to come out to Realtor Day on the Hill June 12th, right, Johnny, and have a big showing on Beacon Hill on June 12th with us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I have a couple of slides at the end, including a first preview of some of the things we're going to talk about that I have not shown to anyone else yet. So you guys are getting the preview before it goes live. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of an overview of just kind of what's going on. So we're at the start of a new 2-year legislative session. So we kind of had a bit of a slow start, which sometimes happens at the start of the 2-year session, as well as in particular that was added onto now by having a new governor. So typically the governor's budget would start a bit earlier in the year because we had Governor Healy was newly elected. Her budget came a bit later. It wasn't due until early March, whereas typically it would be due at the end of January. So that got things off to a bit of a slower start. I highlighted where we are right now. We're literally working through the Senate budget as we speak. Senate Ways and Means finalized their budget last week. All legislators had to have their amendments that they're proposing in by the end of the week. We're reviewing them now. We're going to be putting forth some testimony soon, probably later today, and then the Senate will debate their budget early next week, starting on Tuesday. So once they finalize their budget, it will then go to a conference committee that will iron out the differences between the House and the Senate, whatever their final versions have, will get sort of ironed out, and then we'll have a final budget, hopefully by the end of that month. The budget is technically due at the stroke of midnight at the end of June. The legislature usually roughly sticks to that, although I think the last couple of years they've come in a little bit late, but not any sort of alarming degree of late within the next week or two. Sometimes they just go a little bit into early July. So I'll have more details on that. And then looking ahead even further, I have August 2nd highlighted there. That is a day to keep an eye on because that is when so-called initiative petitions must be submitted to the Attorney General for the 2024 ballot. So there are a lot of ballot issues that have been kind of talked about, might be floating around. The one that we are most interested in is potentially one on rent control. So that's a date that we're watching closely. There are other steps in the process beyond that. It's pretty oddly specific and very technical process, but that first step is quite a simple one. You only need to have, I think, 10 or a dozen signatures and submit things to the Attorney General for their review. So there's a very low bar to get over there, and then we'll start to see things potentially going public. For you all to know, I'll talk a little bit more about rent control later, but it's one of the issues that we'll talk about on Day on the Hill, but it is something that we're working on. We've been involved in and preparing potentially for this issue to be coming up legislatively, and as well as potentially on the ballot in 2024. We've been preparing now for years. We worked with the Greater Boston Real Estate Board on their local campaign in the city of Boston, which I think was successful in sort of stretching out their process and making it a bit more cumbersome. The proposal from the city did ultimately pass in Boston, and is now before the legislature. So there will be a hearing in coming months on it. And then we have the end of the first half of the formal session, so coming in November. And then things just basically restart right again for the second year of the 2-year session in 2024. And what typically happens is there'll be a flurry of bills that end up getting passed, sort of right at the end of session as we get into the summer. And one thing that we're also keeping an eye on is there's been talk of some sort of a housing bill, maybe with some bonding, maybe with some policy stuff. It'll certainly be seen as, I think, the avenue for all things housing by advocates on all sides of the dime and all over the spectrum. So it'll be a bill that will be highly contested and one that we're likely to be involved in conversations on. So that could come as early as the fall, or it might stretch potentially into next year. So just some of the things we're watching. Next slide, please. So a bit more detail on the budget, far more than I'm sure you would like to take in, which is fine. The takeaway on this slide is really that these are some housing assistance programs that we track. And what happened in these housing assistance programs is that they sort of floated along for a long time, mostly under the radar. They did their thing. People didn't really notice them too much. They had kind of, level funding, small increases year over year. And they were seen really as kind of the last backstop to homelessness. And they operate in that regard. Then we had the pandemic. When COVID-19 happened, some of these programs were turned to as suddenly having incredibly great importance as industries were shut down, people couldn't work, they didn't have money coming in, and the government was putting in large pots of money, especially the federal government, putting in large swaths of money into these programs, or to states, and sort of saying, you figure it out. And in Massachusetts, that was, okay, we're going to shift how we operate these programs and use that money, staff them up, and get the money out the door. And Massachusetts was highly effective at doing that. And preserved a lot of housing stability for folks, homeowners and tenants alike. So it really demonstrated that, when these programs are well funded, that they can have this massive impact in our society. Now people have gone back to work. We seem to be in something of a new normal, relative stasis kind of with the pandemic. So the question is sort of, what should we do with these programs? Oh, and we've run through the federal dollars. So the state has increased funding in these line items to kind of backfill some of what the federal government had. Don't think it's likely that we'll ever kind of reach those levels of, here's $1 billion in these programs, but the state has year over year done pretty significant increases in them. So I have the last couple of years budgets mapped out, and then I'm comparing the Healy budget, so the governor's first budget, the FY 2024 finalized House budget, and then the FY 2024 Senate Ways and Means budget. So that was the budget they just released last week. And the percentage changes are all year over year. So you can see, for example, the RAFT line item, Residential Assistance for Families in Transition, that was kind of the big program. It was the big pandemic program. And it's been one that has gotten a lot of conversation since then. It's shown its effectiveness. It was kind of drastically broadened in what it could do, the amount of money it could put out, and how it could be spent. They've reined that in some, but also, again, have increased the funding and have increased the ability for folks to be able to access it. And so you're seeing, in FY 2023, there was this 92% increase, so massive increase in funding. And again, that both all three budgets, but especially if you look at the House and the Senate, are looking at pretty significant increases in that line item as well as some others, the emergency assistance one as well for family shelters. So just something to keep an eye on. And I think it's a really good indicator of especially the governor, but as well our leaders in the House and Senate have talked a lot about their commitment to addressing housing challenges. And here they are putting their money where their mouth is by funding these line items. So a really impressive showing from them, and something that we're happy to continue supporting and hope that will continue along this path. Next slide, please. A little more on the budget situation generally. So budgets there is funding, but there's also outside sections that have policy. There are local earmarks. So the House budget had a lot of sort of local funding for housing related issues as well. There was a tweak in the House budget to the MBTA communities law. It's a law that was passed a couple of years ago that we're now starting to get into sort of requiring compliance on. It requires cities and towns that are served by the MBTA to create a reasonably sized zoning district that allows multifamily housing by right around their MBTA station. There's about half the communities, a little more than half the communities in the state are impacted by it. Most have until the end of 2024 to create that unit, that area of zoning. The ones who are sort of most directly served by the MBTA, the inner core communities, have until the end of this year. But even so, communities that are further out need to be taking steps now because it takes a long time especially in communities that have to vote at town council meetings. They have to sort of lay the groundwork. They have to do the planning necessary to create the zoning. They have to queue it up, and they have to convince residents that it makes sense for them to comply with the law. So what the House kind of slipped into their budget was a piece that would essentially remove one of the three funding pots that are up for grabs in the law. Basically says you need to create this zoning, otherwise you will lose these three pots of money. And what the House did is say, well, one of the pots actually we want to keep the way it is. So now there's only two pots of money that you would lose. Again, just a proposal. It's in the House's budget. The Senate budget does not include that, which means that this provision will be before the conference committee. And it's something that I expect we may have something to say about, because we are so strongly supportive of the MBTA communities law and would hope that we wouldn't be weakening it. Another element is so-called Chapter 257, which requires eviction cases for non-payment of rent to essentially be put on pause if you have a pending RAFT application. RAFT being the program I referenced on the prior slide, Residential Assistance for Families in Transition. If you've received a notice to quit, you can apply for this program and potentially get funding to cover the rent that you've missed. So this is a pandemic era policy that was allowed to lapse. And now the legislature is looking at bringing it back and saying, well, if you have this application out there, you need to wait. We can't complete your eviction because if you were to be approved, you would get the funding that would potentially resolve your case. There is identical language in both the House and the Senate budget on this, so it seems likely that something will happen. There's currently an amendment before the Senate that would make some tweaks, so we'll see what happens. If that were to be adopted, then it would open the door for a conference committee to potentially do something different or make some slight changes to kind of how that would operate. And then another piece is brownfield redevelopment credit extension, something that we've supported in the past. The legislature kind of keeps kicking the can down the road with it, which is a good thing. And that was not included in the original budget, but it was added via amendment with our support. So something that we're happy to continue supporting. And again, that does not appear in the Senate budget, so it will likely be before conference, and hopefully it'll get in to the final budget. Oh, and another piece while I'm on the budget that I wanted to mention, the Senate budget, thanks. The Senate budget has an amendment that we'll be supporting that impacts a local issue for the Cape and South Shore, the Holtec decommissioning of the Pilgrim nuclear plant. There's been a lot of talk about what needs to be done there, what is legal, who has authority, is it the federal government, is it the state government? There are several bills out there, and one of the bills has been proposed as an amendment to the Senate budget, and we'll be supporting it along with the Save Our Bay Coalition. It creates another commission to study this. one of the key aspects that I think is really important for this new commission, I know there's already another commission out there, is that the new commission would consider the economic impacts, which obviously very closely touches real estate, as real estate is one of the huge economic drivers. And so I think would be a really great opportunity for our voice to be heard even more loudly on this issue. There was a similar amendment proposed in the House that Save Our Bay kind of backed away from because the House amendment did not have a moratorium on dumping during the committee's work, whereas the Senate amendment, which they will and we will also be supporting, not only creates the commission, but it has explicit language that there should be no dumping and that the agencies that are allowed to approve any sort of dumping are not allowed to do that until the commission has completed all its meetings and issued its final report. Next slide, please. So the beginning of this program kind of talked about that we do legislative advocacy. Well, I think we do advocacy across the government. So we talk to the executive branch. I covered the governor's budget. We're looking forward to the governor creating this housing secretariat. We'll work closely with that person. Of course, we work very closely with the legislature. We also work in front of the judiciary. We had a couple cases recently where we've done amicus briefs, which are so-called friend of the court briefs, where essentially it's an opportunity for anyone who has interest in the issues to be able to share their thoughts and opinions with the court. It can be sort of more legal, or it can even be, data, facts, or industry insight. And that's largely what we've tried to provide. There's a case before the court right now called the Hill-Junius case that could have a potential impact on commercial real estate, which is why we wanted to put forth a brief to explain our interest in the case. So very briefly, in the case, there's a patron murdered outside a nightclub that had recently changed hands. So there was an old landlord, and under the old landlord, there had been a lot of issues at this club, none maybe rising to this level, but there were some fights, there were a lot of complaints, there were indications that there was a problem, especially with how this nightclub operated, and maybe they needed to take some additional measures to increase safety. New landlord comes in, does nothing to increase safety, and very shortly after that, a patron is murdered. The issue that the court put forth when asking for input was whether commercial landlords' duty to prevent reasonably foreseeable criminal acts also includes a duty to learn about criminal acts that happen before they purchase the property. So our concern is that a sweeping opinion from the court could lead to liability for realtors, have to look up information on prior criminal acts and then make some sort of judgment on what that means sort of going forward, which is concerning in terms of opening us up to liability. And then even more so, there's a policy argument for what it will do to properties that may have sort of a challenging history. And often a lot of those properties are based in areas that maybe have lower incomes. And so essentially you're going to limit the ability for landlords to take a chance on them, right? No one's going to want to buy this property if you have to make this sort of judgment on it. So that was essentially what our brief said. There was oral argument in early April that actually featured our brief. Justices explicitly asked about it, and at least one of the attorneys, both attorneys spoke on it, and one kind of explicitly referenced it as, especially drawing out some of the problems that we had highlighted. And a decision is forthcoming, so stay tuned on that. We hope to have more information soon. Next slide, please. Day on the Hill. So teased it at the beginning, June 12th. We're very excited for it to be in person for the first time since who knows when, I think 4 years ago. So we're super excited to be able to have that and have you all at the State House. We are still finalizing our keynote speaker and the exact schedule, but the event will begin around 11. I think we'll have some breakfast stuff out, and then, we hope that everyone will come. So we'll have a keynote, we'll have some speaking program. We'll talk a little bit about the items that we're hoping you'll discuss, which I have on the next slide. And then we'll all go to our respective Hill visits and get to meet with your members, with their staffers, with all the folks from your delegation. So this is a preview of what is to come. This is a non-final version, so take it easy with the screenshots, but this is the inside part of a brochure that we'll be providing to folks. It is in sort of final copy editing. It's going to go to print, I think, sometime this week. There's some great stuff on the other side, but I'm not showing you that. So there's a reason you should attend. And we also are going to have some other materials for you. But these are the priority issues that we're going to cover this year. So we have housing production, first-time home buyer savings account, which that one in particular is one that where the Cape and Islands loom large. The primary sponsors in the House and Senate are Dylan Fernandes and Julian Sear. And I actually was just at an event pretty recently with Representative Fernandes, who very explicitly told me, like, I think that first-time homebuyers has a great chance of success. And the more that you guys can do, you got meaning all realtors, but sure, you know, Cape and Islands realtors, most especially being his constituents, the more that you can do to talk up this bill, the greater chance we'll have at success. It's a bill that's gained increasing traction over the last several years, first kind of through the heightened awareness of the impacts of student loan debt. And then, you know, through COVID and the massive spikes in prices that we've seen, I think legislators are really interested in ways to provide more tools for people to be able to access homeownership. And we're really well positioned on this one being one of those solutions. We also have Fair Housing and Diversity Education Bill, which we're again kind of perfectly timed here with NAR just coming online, saying that they're going to be requiring realtors to do that. I think it even strengthens our position to say, look, we have already made this commitment. We are already doing this. And we want all licensees to do this because it's that important. This is something that touches every single transaction. And so we're the leaders on this and we need everyone to come along with us. And then the final issue is one Catherine referenced. So we have a form for homeowners afflicted with crumbling concrete foundations. I think fortunately in your area, there are no or very, very few homes afflicted with this issue, which is a very good thing because it is an absolutely devastating issue that is impacting an ever increasing lot of homes in the sort of the central swath of the state, going all the way from the South Connecticut border to all the way to the northern border of Massachusetts. It's this naturally occurring mineral that happens in foundations when exposed to water and air and a great deal of time, 10, 20 years. It causes your foundation to crack and then ultimately start to crumble. And that basically starts a clock for when your house is either going to cave in or you need to pay to replace the foundation. And current technology, the only way to really do that is to actually lift your entire home, take out the faulty foundation and replace it with a new one, which costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And there's currently no fix and there's no testing for quarries to make sure that this issue doesn't happen in the future. So it's something that we really have this incredible opportunity to fight for homeowners. And so that's one of our top issues for Day on the Hill. We are opposing two longtime pieces that we've spent decades in opposition to successfully: transfer taxes, rent control. Both have seen an increased amount of interest in the last couple of years, both largely driven by renter-heavy cities, especially the city of Boston. Transfer taxes, city of Boston came online with a bill a few years ago, and they've kind of refreshed that over the last couple of years. And then, of course, rent control, spoke about it earlier. That is something that we are opposing. And the city of Boston just came online with their rent control proposal. It is now before the legislature, and so we're opposing it there. So that's a little preview for Day on the Hill, and I hope you'll join us at the event. And that's all I have. Happy to answer questions.
Hey, Johnny, one thing I want to get to for you and I that you and I have been working on is the DEP proposal on the Title V regs. Both with your help, CCIAOR and MAR put in our comments back to DEP. Have we heard anything about when those regulations around mandating an IA system if you don't have the watershed permit would come into effect? Anything latest on that? As I get that question often, right, obviously from members, because this kind of triggers the Catherine conversation earlier, right, about disclosures, about, we don't know what the regs are, so there's really no disclosures to make right now, I would assume, Catherine. But however, as soon as we do, then we'll probably have to readjust and have a disclosure form out and everything else around that for properties in those nitrogen sensitive areas. So Johnny, anything latest that you've heard around when DEP may be promulgating the regulations?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. And I want to, just before I get into that, kind of give a bit of a shout out to CCIAOR. You guys were the leaders on this. We really piggybacked on the work that you all did. I remember attending a program where you had an incredible turnout. Your members are extremely well versed on this issue, and props to you all for really leading the charge on it. So we also did submit comments, as well as work with some of the South Shore area realtors on theirs. And the latest is, so we're in an interesting spot. This conversation, as you likely all recall, started like in the fall of last year. Things got kind of bogged down. There were a ton of concerns led again by Cape and Islands realtors. Us at the state level as well were part of that conversation of, you know, we have major concerns about homeowners. We want to do the right thing for the environment, but there's got to be a better way that doesn't impact homeowners as severely as this would. They then sort of process got extended. So there was another round of listening sessions and comments. And that kind of all went quiet around March. And since then, there's nothing has been put out publicly. I believe conversations have continued, and that there's been some further outreach to some of the folks who participated on the advisory committee for that. And that's as far as I know. So I'm thinking that what I would hope would happen is that there might be even a further round or some amendments, sort of put forth, and then a further round of comments. Absolutely no guarantees on that, though. They could sort of just say, here are the final regs, and we're working with that. But given just how contentious it was, and I believe there was even talk of a lawsuit from some South Shore towns, I would hope that there might be an opportunity for even further discussion, which I think is the right thing to do on this.
Yeah, and I dropped our post that has our comment letters, both from us and MAR, and kind of a recap of what's going on there in the comments there. And then I think another question came in about, a lot of talk, and we spent a lot of time out here around housing, how we're going to address middle class housing going forward, middle income housing going forward. How does that budget process work for like housing projects to get money into projects? Because a lot of our organizations out here, Community Development Partnership, Housing Assistance Corporation, they get money through the budget every year for housing projects. So how does that money work, and how does that work for those kind of big dollars from the state for housing projects out here?
Yeah, so there's several avenues for funding these sorts of projects. There are state programs that get funded through the budget that then municipalities, developers, all sorts of groups can try to vie for to access. And then there's also a lot of earmarking that goes on. So I mentioned in the House's budget, there was about $12 million in housing related earmarks that happened. And I expect there'll be, similar amounts of money that go to the Cape, and a lot of those that are included in the Senate budget writ large, and some of those may go to the Cape that are specific Cape sort of housing programs. And I will say that I know that your legislators, they talk about this all the time. They're really good on housing issues. They are, they're leaders in a lot of the conversations on this. And I can picture in my head, having reviewed, there were like 1,200 amendments. So I don't remember them specifically, but I know I saw, I think Sear and Moran, for the Senate budget had put forth several different amendments that touched housing in certain ways, of trying to add funding for this program or that funding, or that program that then are, can be accessed by folks in the community, or they're used for programmatic pieces that help assist sort of the housing picture.
Yeah, and because that's kind of there. And then is the housing bond bill to economic development bill has housing provisions in it too, right?
Yeah, so both those are avenues. Like I said, the housing bond bill has already come up in conversation of, I think every housing advocate sees that as the golden ticket for the thing that they want, which of course it simply cannot be. But yes, there will be a housing bond bill. that seems like it's going to happen. The timing is very unclear, and typically there's an economic development bill that may be more a next year conversation, and that often has a lot of housing pieces in it. With the creation of the new housing secretary and housing, there being a little bit more separation between sort of economic development and housing, or at least them each having their own spotlight. I don't want to say they're totally separate. They're both work very closely together, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how that shakes out, of whether there may be more housing specific things and economic development specific things, and maybe less of just lumping them together. But I think those are conversations that probably will be heating up more, after certainly once we get through the budget, and then maybe even later into the fall or into early 2024.
Yeah, and any inside knowledge on how first housing secretary will be?
That I don't know. I've heard pretty much everyone under the sun. So we're very interested, and we look forward to working with whoever it'll be. And there's a bit of a quirk in some of the budget in terms of like how they'll be funded and how it'll all work. So there's a lot to kind of be figured out there, and whoever ends up being that person is going to have they're going to have their work cut out for them. But we're excited that housing is going to be able to get that spotlight, and this sort of devotion of resources and attention makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, thank you very much, you two. I'll see more questions coming in, but I know y'all are both reachable at MAR if very, very, very responsive if anyone has any more questions. So thank you guys very much for joining us today.